Welcome to our webinar, where we delve into the crucial topic of how we can mobilize capital towards natural infrastructure projects, including from private sector and capital markets. My name is Kim Neale, and it is my honor to be joining you today as a guest on the unceded traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples of Manitou-Missing, the Spirit Island, also known to many as Manitoulin Island, the largest freshwater island in the world. My Anishinaabe and Métis ancestors come from not far from this place in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territories. Before colonization, my ancestors came to Manitou-Missing every spring because this island that sits in the heart of the Great Lakes and in the heart of Turtle Island was the heart of the Indigenous-led conservation economy, mobilizing capital, trade, culture, relationships, and most notably, maple syrup. Before our cultural and land rights were removed from this place, more maple syrup was produced by Indigenous peoples of Manitou-Missing than anywhere else on Turtle Island. Now, much of the richest maple syrup and ecotourism lands in these traditional territories are owned private landowners, and several of which are private land trusts. This Manitou-Missing context for natural infrastructure financing is just one example where we must consider ways to equitably share the benefits that will inevitably come from financing nature, so it can restore Indigenous knowledge systems and nationhood while achieving climate and biodiversity goals. Personally, I come to this topic as an Indigenous person seeking pathways to economic reconciliation, as an environmental engineer seeking long-term durable climate solutions, as a reformed Bay Street and finance insurance expert, seeking to apply my experience designing some of Canada's first restoration bonds and parametric insurance policies that have contributed to the mobilization of capital and investor confidence in climate and biodiversity targets. In my role at Natural Assets Initiative and on the leadership circle of the Indigenous-led Restore, Assert, and Defend network, we are focused and very much involved in the implementation of pilots for new and novel bioregional watershed-scale financing mechanisms that support community natural infrastructure priorities. We are all aware that we need to accelerate action on nature restoration and conservation, and reimagining how infrastructure services are delivered so they are delivered in a sustainable way by working together with nature. With natural infrastructure, we have the opportunity to simultaneously address aging infrastructure needs, support reconciliation, protect biodiversity, and support the economy. We are here to hear about implementation of finance pilots in Canada and recent research to better understand that finance instruments are being considered and applied to ultimately chart a pathway forward in Canada. We will discuss what is needed to channel capital into natural infrastructure projects, including developing the business case for natural infrastructure, measurement of outcomes, and most importantly, relationship building and collaboration to get the finance sector, municipalities, Indigenous nations, and other partners all pushing and pulling ideally in the same direction to scale up financing for natural infrastructure. I'm so grateful to have with us today three incredible thought leaders in this particular field. Marina Puzyreva, a senior policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in the Water Program, which delves into the economic case for nature-based solutions in water management. Her expertise spans economics, finance, and public policy. Marina leads the forthcoming IISD report on financing natural infrastructure in the Canadian prairies. She also collaborates with Indigenous and municipal partners, aiming to broaden perspectives on value in policy decisions and establish criteria favoring natural infrastructure and water management over traditional approaches. Robert Wilson, or Rob Wilson, as I've learned as well, is the Director of Conservation Finance at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. His work focuses on conservation finance programs, supporting nature-based climate solutions, especially in carbon finance. He's involved in the federal carbon protocol design and provincial offset program development. With degrees in political science, resource management, and an MBA, he spearheads impactful land conservation projects. Rob's main goal is to make nature investable by attracting private capital into nationwide nature-based initiatives. Thank you, Rob, for joining us today. And last but not least, and someone who spearheaded one of my really favorite Indigenous-led projects here in Canada is Diane Laura Ajaliez. I hope I've said that right. As an associate professor at the Ivey Business School out of Western University in London, Ontario, she explores innovative approaches to transform financial markets for sustainability. A no short task indeed. Recognized for her work in responsible investing, ESG integration, and conservation finance, she founded the Sustainable Finance Lab at the Center for Building Sustainable Value and is involved in conservation finance, aiming to direct capital toward preserving ecosystems, notably through conservation impact bonds. Diane Laura has also published extensively, including a book, Chains of Finance, How Investment Management is Shaped, and contributions in major academic journals. This just as a sort of like bookkeeping kind of piece, we are going to record today's webinar. You'll receive a copy and some key takeaways and a link to an evaluation survey, which I'll remind you about at the end of this webinar. I mean, we'd appreciate if you fill out that evaluation survey to help us adapt our educational materials going forward. We'll also have a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please keep those questions coming in. And I'll first jump into our first speaker, Marina, who will present an overview of natural infrastructure costs and benefits and share insights that from the recent IISD report focused on how to ensure great private financing for natural infrastructure projects.
Hey, great. Thank you, Kim. And it's a pleasure to join and to share some of our recent findings. Just a second, I'll make sure. Okay, can you see the slides?
We can, but you might want to like put it on a slideshow.
Yeah, just a second. Okay, how about now? Perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be sharing with you kind of an overview of what natural infrastructure is. So natural infrastructure costs and its benefits, and what are the investment needs for natural infrastructure in Canada, and what are the financing mechanisms that private investors have identified and that we can use as a path forward for us to invest in natural infrastructure. So on this slide, you can see a spectrum of infrastructure solutions, starting from exclusively gray infrastructure to hybrid infrastructure and to natural infrastructure. So our focus is natural infrastructure, which are conserved, restored, or engineered ecosystems that provide specific infrastructure outcomes, while also providing a variety of co-benefits. So for example, wetland conservation. Natural infrastructure can also be part of hybrid infrastructure, which natural elements are used to augment some of the gray infrastructure solutions. So for example, a green roof in the urban environment. And then incorporating maybe a wetland component in the wastewater treatment process that is done conventionally with the gray infrastructure. So the benefits of natural infrastructure, capturing them and understanding them is very important for an investment case. So if we think from infrastructure services perspective, natural infrastructure is very well suited to provide water-related benefits as the kind of very common infrastructure services: flood mitigation, drought mitigation, water supply, and water treatment. But it's not only that, because there are also many co-benefits. For example, benefits to habitat, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, recreation, education, and human health. So these co-benefits are especially important when we consider adapting to the effects of climate change and just to make it more cost effective and to make a better business case for those types of solutions. For example, in the picture here, you could see Pelly's Lake in Manitoba, which is actively managed wetland for flood control, but also provides many other benefits related to nutrient removal and also use of biomass and also education. So when we discuss some of the benefits which would accrue to different stakeholders and parties, but then what about the cost of natural infrastructure? The most commonly we think about the construction costs when it comes to natural infrastructure, but there are all these different phases to implement a natural infrastructure project. You need some funds to, frame your infrastructure options. You need resources to develop project concept and ideas. So all these different stages need capital and to eventually scale up those types of nature solutions. And of course, construction funds are more available than others. But as we kind of chart a path forward for Canada, of course, we would need supports in all its different stages. So here on this slide is just examples of general ways to, mobilize capital for infrastructure projects and natural infrastructure projects in particular. So the very general, there's, debt instruments, various debt instruments, which, the investors provide money and they expect it, to be returned with an interest, and the investors need to be confident in the repayment. Then there are also equity investments. They're typically riskier and haven't been applied to natural infrastructure projects much to date, or maybe at all. And then there are grants, which is quite common. They're not a financing mechanism per se. They're money are provided by government, private companies, philanthropists to a project. It doesn't need to be repaid, but certain conditions and outcomes are specified. So who typically funds natural infrastructure? There's public funding is, of course, the largest source of capital for natural infrastructure in Canada. And I've presented here some of the numbers from the analysis that IISD has done recently. It's still not published. Will be published in an upcoming brief earlier in the new year. So we looked at 17 national funds in Canada that targeting infrastructure, conservation, and development, like programs like Indigenous Guardians or disaster DMAF or ISIP, like those types of programs. So, and we try to look at it more in depth and try to understand, so what's the share of them, of those types of funding programs that goes to natural infrastructure. And this is an approximate number that we derived, like 233 million annually through national programs. Of course, there are also provincial programs and other types of grant funding available. Then how do you really put it in perspective and try to understand it relative to the need? So here it's really tricky to find good numbers for funding needs, or but there two numbers found in literature, the funding needs for conservation and also for infrastructure, measured in billions of dollars per year. So even though it's not framed specifically as natural infrastructure, you could, and conservation is part of the natural infrastructure solution. So you could clearly see that we're short, and there needs to be other ways to attract capital towards natural infrastructure. So that got us thinking, okay, why don't we talk to private sector and understand better solutions from their side, what they see as promising financing mechanisms. So on this slide, you could see that the very commonly cited barriers to financing natural infrastructure. Difficulties in quantifying and monetizing benefits, lack of revenue streams from these projects, and that it takes time for the benefits to be realized, and they're often small and localized projects. So in our recent study that we've done in this year, last year, and it'll be part of our upcoming publication, we talked to 13 major investors from various sectors, such as asset management, industry, and insurance sector, and to identify possible solutions to mobilizing more capital for natural infrastructure projects from private sources specifically. So and from those interviews, there were a couple of instruments that were highlighted, such as carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and also outcome-based financing model, natural asset companies, and insurance. So I won't be going into each of those instruments, but I wanted to specifically highlight an outcome-based financing model as kind of a model that brings together very key elements that are typical of natural infrastructure. So it could be potentially promising financing mechanisms for natural infrastructure, but includes active participation of both public and private entities. But essentially the challenge of financing is how do you convert the benefits that I talked about into revenue streams for investors. So in this model, there's a way to engage beneficiaries. So they would pay for ecosystem services generated by the project, be it cleaning water or carbon, sequestering carbon. So those types of revenue streams could be leveraged in that model. And this, the value is that it diversifies the cash flow for various beneficiaries and creates returns for investors. So the key role in that model is for a facilitator that essentially negotiates the price and brings those stakeholders together and negotiates the price with the outcome buyers and sets the contract terms for all parties involved. And the key element is, of course, since it's an outcome-based financing model, so the performance targets and outcomes are being specified ahead of time and monitored, and the payment structure typically aligns with the performance targets. So just a broad general example, this is from the Forest Resilience Bond in the USA that we could think about in context of Canada as well. So that's essentially the example of how it can work, where there's investors that provide upfront capital to a certain vehicle, like the special purpose vehicle here owned by Blue Forest Resilience Bond, and those upfront capital finances the implementation of certain restoration activities, like forest restoration, and the benefits that come out from those restoration activities, such as fire suppression, water benefits, being purchased by the beneficiaries. So this is a downstream water utility and also the federal departments that are interested in fire suppression benefits. So those outcome buyers, the cash flow for those outcome buyers essentially pays back investors with interest. So this types of model can improve some of the financial efficiencies and deploy capital quicker, and potentially could be replicated and scaled. So that's kind of in a nutshell our findings. but then it's very important to consider some ethics in those types of in scaling up those types of instruments. So as you know, private financing, as I mentioned, for natural infrastructure relies on market-based approaches. So how do you create a revenue streams out of nature services? So inevitably, if we think about scaling up that way, there'll be monetization of ecosystem services, and those types of services will be traded between entities or individuals. So in scaling up, of course, it's imperative to consider ownership of land, of the underlying natural assets, and prioritize indigenous rights, equity, and justice related to ownership of those lands and services, and so on. So, and in kind of implementation of natural infrastructure, implementation of certain projects, to recover the costs, the fee needs to be set from the users of the services, for example, for water services. If the communities are unable to pay, then there needs to be some government support. So this type of considerations also need to happen. And of course, as we use those instruments as carbon or biodiversity credits, we need to aim for net improvements in environmental outcomes. So those mechanisms that we build, they actually result in tangible environmental improvements. All right, so that's an introduction to national infrastructure and how we can scale up our investments. If you have any questions or want to connect, please feel free to reach out.
There's one question that we'll maybe table after the presentations, Marina. First of all, I'm so well done, and thank you so much. Outcomes-based financing mechanisms is absolutely something Natural Assets is pursuing right now, and we're the facilitator on an outcomes-based watershed scale financing project in Southern Ontario. But there's one really interesting question here that you might want to think about till the end. Are regulations needed to create the market for outcome beneficiaries, or is or are there other mechanisms? So that's something maybe for you to think about. While our next speaker is up and he can begin sharing his screen to give you some foreshadowing. Our second speaker, as I said at the start, is Rob Wilson, and now we'll delve into Canadian examples of financing natural infrastructure, especially as it relates to conservation finance to preserve valuable ecosystems, and to understand what models work and how they can be scaled up. And Nature Conservancy of Canada certainly is doing quite a bit of that right now. So over to you, Rob. Well done. You're quick with your PowerPoint presentation, Sherry. Love it.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm delighted to be here today. We use the term natural infrastructure, but we might just as easily refer to natural infrastructure as natural capital. And when we conserve natural capital assets or natural infrastructure, we not only protect critically important habitat for a wide array of species, but we protect the important ecosystems and the ecological processes that underpin these ecosystems. So importantly, this includes the array of ecological goods and services that Marina referred to as well, that these ecosystems provide, and they largely determine the quality of our human life itself. So the conservation of lands and waters, a unique nature-based solution, it underpins most of Canada's natural capital. It offers us a real opportunity to mitigate impacts, improve landscape resiliency, and support adaptation to some of the most devastating effects of climate change, including catastrophic events such as flooding, wildfire, windstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. Moreover, and equally important, these approaches offer opportunities to promote the use of green infrastructure as a first line of defense against some of the increasingly frequent catastrophic events that we are all facing. And that in turn reduces the need for engineered assets or gray infrastructure and delivers enormous co-benefits provided by the natural ecosystems themselves. So to a large extent, natural assets or natural infrastructure has been economically invisible, I always think, because the benefits have been largely taken for granted and not paid for. And it's never been more important to not treat nature as a free commons or in economic terms an externality. So viewing nature as natural capital or green infrastructure, if you will, on that continuum that Marina referred to, allows us to view nature from a different lens, an economic lens, and allows us to value natural capital and the services that it provides, and how incentivizing all members of society, governments and corporations and individuals, to look at nature and conservation in an alternative way, an investment in our future. At the Nature Conservancy of Canada, our mission is to protect Canada's important landscapes and the biodiversity that they support for future generations, using all the tools currently available and the creation of new and innovative approaches to financing these kinds of assets. So over the next few minutes, I'd like to outline some of these emerging approaches that we're experimenting with and using across several different ecosystem types. And I'd like to begin with actually with one of the themes of the IISD report is grasslands. So turning first to Canada's prairie grasslands, these are complex natural systems, ecosystems, and they primarily span the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and they support important biodiversity and habitat for many species and many, many migratory birds, for example. Grasslands also represent one of the most endangered ecosystems on the entire planet, and Canada's lost more than 80% of its native grasslands. And moreover, the rate of loss continues unabated as we lose nearly 60,000 hectares per year, about 150,000 acres, each and every year, principally due to the conversion of grasslands to cultivated crop production. So conversion continues to outpace conservation. These ecosystems, in effect, natural infrastructure assets, provide an array of ecological services and goods, including carbon storage, ongoing sequestration, soil stability, prevention of erosion, water retention and filtration, which mitigates drought risk. It provides important habitat for pollinators, birds, insects, many species of mammals, as well as forage for both wild and domestic animals. Native grasslands help to effectively mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change, and they're an important source of grazing and forage for the cattle industry. NCC and other organizations have long understood the importance of conserving temperate grasslands, using a variety of mechanisms to protect these systems in order to achieve durable, long-lasting positive biodiversity outcomes. And by doing so, we avoid investing in gray infrastructure or engineered solutions designed to provide similar services, and that nowhere near as efficient though as nature is. So the mechanisms or tools by which we're protecting these grasslands often include outright fee simple securement of lands, but in many cases they involve the use of a conservation easement, which is a legally binding agreement entered into with a landowner who retains ownership of land, but is restricted in terms of the activities that can be conducted on that landscape. It's very well recognized that proper grazing management of cattle can serve as an effective disturbance regime, which optimizes ecosystem functions and is highly compatible with conservation and the maintenance and enhancement of important biodiversity outcomes. And that's why we are working so closely with the Canadian Cattle Association and other organizations such as Ducks Unlimited to protect these natural assets. One of the biggest opportunities to conserve Canada's remaining grasslands is through incentivizing livestock farmers and ranchers and beef producers to keep grasslands intact and fully functioning through ongoing range health assessments and implementation of pasture management programs, including active pasture rotation and range management. With funding from groups such as the Weston Foundation, with increasing interest from potential corporate partners in the agriculture or supply chain related sectors, for example, fertilizer and native seed companies, NCC is able to work collaboratively with other stakeholders to provide incentive-based payments for projects that support positive biodiversity outcomes and the retention of intact grass, despite the stronger economic case that conversion to cash crops may offer to these producers and landowners. Moreover, a broad array of products can attract funding to support investment from an increasingly broad array of investors in this kind of natural capital asset base. And they fund activities to improve water management, weed and species management, reductions in fencing to improve wildlife movement, and improving range utilization. So incentivizing producers through payment for service models, which will include carbon, and I'll come to that later, and also through shorter term or longer term conservation types of instruments with corresponding annual payments being made to producers to keep rangelands and pasturelands intact, or through dedicated EG&S conservation fund structures that are under consideration as well. They offer real opportunities to protect our native grasslands, and are excellent examples of investing in green infrastructure assets or natural capital assets instead of gray infrastructure assets as well. I just want to also mention the importance of restoration programs as well, which is critically important to help arrest the conversion rates of native grasslands. We need to accelerate conservation through restoration. It's expensive, time-consuming work, but it's critical to restore full ecological functionality to these systems as well, and to deliver ongoing ecological goods and services that they were originally intended to provide. So, so strong emphasis on restoration work and identification of the beneficiaries of this restoration work, which includes not only all levels of government, who are able, by the way, to count the carbon stored in these landscapes, but municipalities, industry suppliers, other corporations with assets at risk, insurance companies, and many financial investors are interested in these kinds of programs. So there's lots of ways to protect native grasslands. I want to move a little further, and this is one example, by the way. This is the McIntyre Ranch, which was conserved by way of a conservation easement earlier this year. One of the largest ranches in Canada and probably the largest private prairie grasslands protection initiative in Canadian history. This will also very likely become a carbon project, and it's home to a vast array of species that make use of this, and it's also a grazing habitat and a great example of a working landscape approach to conservation, and importantly will attract capital through potentially a carbon offset project that will ultimately be developed on a project. Okay. I want to move a little farther east, though, into Ontario and talk about another restoration-based program that's operating successfully. The insurance industry in particular has demonstrated its willingness to actively support wetland restoration projects, particularly in upstream watershed regions, which control the risk of water and flooding to downstream communities, which are increasingly at risk of catastrophic funding. And Marina alluded to that, I think, as well. Insurers understand very well that nature-based flood control in upstream watersheds mitigates downstream flood risk and reduces associated insurance payouts. There is an economic case to be made. And it also maintains the flow of ecological goods and services to these communities and bring many economic and non-economic benefits. We're about to undertake a major flood risk mitigation program in the Ottawa region that'll be supported by local municipalities, other NGOs, downstream beneficiaries, and local residents, all of whom benefit from this flood risk reduction work through conservation of intact lands and the restoration of degraded lands as well in this kind of landscape. So this is an example of the kinds of restoration work that we undertake on some of these degraded lands. So we literally will remove tiling that may exist under the lands that was put in place to reduce water flow. And ultimately, what's amazing is that quite literally within 3 to 5 years, we're going to reestablish a fully functional wetland that once again provides the flow of ecological goods and services to the local area, benefits local communities, and attenuates flood risk and groundwater management. Again, through the use of improved metrics, as we get better at establishing these kinds of programs, we're better able to measure and monitor the long-term outcomes, which can be expressed in economic terms, and in turn attract investors and capital who benefit from these outcomes. And whether that's through business risk reduction or asset protection of organizations with assets that are at risk of in these areas, or through the lenses of ESG ratings or other reporting requirements. So a great economic program that can be used. This is another program that we're just about to start in the Quebec program. It's Tidal Marsh Conservation. It's going to be funded by a very large offshore insurance company, and we hope to attract other investment capital as well. Tidal marshes in Canada are critically important wetland habitats that buffer many of the effects of climate change, storm surges, etc. They slow shoreline erosion, they offer habitat for species, and they also buttress against extreme weather events. They are fragile ecosystems, though, and under threat of conversion actively. So the goal of this program is to secure tidal marsh areas and increase the overall biodiversity and improved functionality and climate change resilience of these habitats. So we're working, and this will involve things like Phragmites control, invasive species control, eelgrass and beachgrass restoration programs, and actually transplantation programs, as well as sandbar restoration, protecting tidal marsh ecosystems. And we're also exploring the opportunity to use carbon offset protocols to be established in the Canadian context, by which we can incentivize greater protection of these systems with market-based mechanisms. And I wanted to turn to carbon credits for a minute, just very briefly. We've been involved in this space for more than a decade, and this is an example of a forest-based carbon offset project that was the largest conservation project on private land in Canadian history. It's called Darkwoods in southeastern British Columbia. We've been monetizing carbon offsets that for more than a decade on this project to support the conservation of additional landscapes. But we're also moving beyond forest-based carbon programs into grasslands-based programs, and have been piloting a avoided conversion of grasslands protocol in southern Alberta with the support of Shell and many other stakeholders to test its efficacy in terms of incentivizing this kind of mechanism to attract capital. These projects, when they're developed under international standards and like the Climate Action Reserve, which this one is accredited under, they provide and attract significant funding to help incentivize protection of these landscapes. So they're highly beneficial. What's interesting in these pilots is that they also help inform us on how to better manage these protocols in a Canadian context. So this is one that holds a lot of promise for us. It's going to require some modification through the pilot program and as we try to scale it beyond. But again, a carbon credit program like this offers a lot of incentive to landowners and rewards them for maintaining good conditions in that kind of landscape. We're also another highly threatened ecosystem that's of interest to us and enormously important carbon sink is Canada's wetland complexes, principally in this case peatlands, and they offer another potential carbon offset opportunity. So we're being supported by a large Canadian insurer, Intact Financial, to undertake the development of a carbon offset protocol that will avoid the conversion of peatlands. So it's a multi-year project. We're just beginning it. We've set up a technical expert group. We're engaged extensively as well with Indigenous members. We're actively engaging them to bring traditional knowledge systems to this kind of protocol development process so that we can marry traditional knowledge and Western science-based approaches in terms of carbon sequestration and storage and make use of all the knowledge that's available to us. So we're quite optimistic that this is going to be a successful program and looking forward to implementing it. I want to briefly just also mention an emerging credit system called nature credits that Verra, which is a leading international standard body, is delving into. And these are credits that will be used to across various environmental asset classes that are to be determined still, maybe species at risk, maybe water, threatened habitat, but they will not be used as offsets, so they're credits. So they're nature positive kinds of crediting frameworks. So we're quite optimistic about this as a non-offset based form of building the nature positive side of balance sheet. There's no question that it's very attractive to organizations who are trying to build the asset side of their balance sheet in terms of nature and natural capital assets. And we think will be in the future as it becomes developed and piloted later next year as a source of sort of incentivizing and bringing capital into conserving these natural infrastructure assets, again, avoiding gray infrastructure. Okay. So those are some of the approaches that we at the Nature Conservancy Canada are adopting. But I just wanted to also mention a couple of the issues that we also face. Achieving scale, always a challenge. So we do have to have policy conditions at all levels of government that incentivize this. Indigenous-led conservation will be critical to conserving these green infrastructure assets or natural capital assets. And exploring the use of Indigenous protected conserved areas, other forms, OECMs as well. We need to be able to aggregate lands, identify willing stakeholders, and also use and develop other benefit sharing agreements and approaches to sharing the benefits of this as well. Some of the challenge to mobilizing private capital, just identification of the beneficiaries of these projects and programs, improving the metrics by which we can express the business case for nature support. That's really important to us. How do we also get it on the balance sheet? Something that the Natural Asset Initiative is very much working on. So how do we also demonstrate how these projects count towards Canada's goals for both biodiversity and climate? And also supporting corporate disclosure, by the way, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, et cetera. And some of the challenges, improved data. We need better data and better metrics. We require more standardized metrics by which to express outcomes. We need market pricing signals and also continue to develop mechanisms by which we can protect these landscapes across the various ecosystem types. There's no question that this is a very tried and tested and true method by way we can conserve green infrastructure, and we hope to do so in the future through a variety of these mechanisms. So with that, I will turn it over back to Kim. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Just running over a little bit of time, so I'll be hopefully Diane, Laura, you can jump in, and thank you so much, Rob. And thank you, Diane, Laura, for answering some of the questions in the chat. I think that some of Rob's presentation also sort of demonstrated that the insurance industry is one of those really key players for really like creating that burgeoning market for different types of outcomes-based financing. So now we're going to talk to a really innovative project on conservation impact bonds in the Carolinian zone that is testing a novel approach to conservation finance, which diversifies investments through an outcomes-based financing model and brings in an important reconciliation lens. And something that Rob mentioned, marrying, Indigenous strengths and Western science strengths with, which is actually coined by Elder Albert Marshall, an Indigenous leader, that's called two-eyed seeing. And it's a two-eyed seeing perspective to conservation finance space. Thank you so much, Diane Laura. I'm so excited for this presentation.
Thank you, merci beaucoup. Je vais aller assez vite. I'm gonna try to go faster because I know we are running out of time. So I just also want to acknowledge the land on which I am right now, which is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, and Lenape and Etowandon peoples. This project involves Indigenous partners. They involve also conservation partners. I'm only the representative of the research team at the lab here. I'm leading a sustainable finance lab that is specialized in conservation finance and economic reconciliation. So we're working on the design of financial product to fund biodiversity in the spirit of the truth and reconciliation. So you've already had some presentation about outcome-based mechanisms, and I've been answering some questions on the chat as well. These conservation impact bonds, the first pilot is the Shkanzibi Conservation Impact Bond. It was based on Chippewa of the Thames First Nation in southwestern Ontario. And it's a place-based collaboration in financial instruments. And the goal is to accelerate the protection of Alcine landscapes and the spirit and practice of reconciliation. We are looking at 400 actors, and we are right now in a scaling mode. So I was tasked in the presentation to really look at the replication and the scaling. So I'm going to do it now. Also, Kim, you already talked about two-eyed seeing. So the spirits and the practice of this financial product is really to get the best of both Indigenous and Western knowledge and modes of governance. So this is what we do have, a two-eyed seeing outcome-based product. I'm going to go over the first pilot so everybody gets it, how it works. And then I'm going to go up to the replication and the scaling. So that's the first pilot because it's also community-based participatory research with the lab. Everything is really documented and you can find everything. It's open access. You have the report, we have a story map. There's more academic papers going on. So we also use this project as a way to build and share knowledge. And as also this is the spirit of truth and reconciliation. Knowledge doesn't belong to us; it belongs to everyone, particularly to the Indigenous partners. So as you could see here at the left of the screen, you have the impact investor. So that was Verge Capital, which is a local impact investors here in London, Ontario. The impact investors, they're going to bring money. And this money per se is already something really good because, as you know, when you do conservation or restoration, you have some benefits in having the money in year one, not having year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. Like you have grants because you have the money and you can plant right away. And so you have already ecological benefits here from having a bunch of money at the beginning. So Verge Capital is going to bring money. And then you do have a project facilitator, which was Carolinian Canada, which is the oldest conservation organization, one of the oldest conservation organizations in the North America. And there's a coalition of different organizations. This Carolinian Canada, they have access to habitat partners. So they're going to redistribute the money to the habitat partners. If the projects are being said to be successful, and there have been some questions in the chat about what success looks like the outcome metrics that have been decided upon. So if those impacts is being validated by a third-party evaluator, then the outcome payers that you see at the right, and in the case of the Shkanzibi, there was a 3M, Pollinator Partnership Canada, and some government contribution. Then those outcome payers are going to pay back the investors' capital plus interest, okay? What is really important here is that you see on the top of the slide that there's indigenous communities. So everything that is being decided within the bond follows a practice of 2IISing, which means that there's both Western and indigenous knowledge, but there's also the usage of governance structures when you have indigenous leadership, and not only the Western conservation leadership. It's not only the outcome payers deciding what we should do, is everybody is at the table. So why do we want to do that? Why don't we have just a grant model, just get the money and let's do it, There are a few advantages that we have seen through the research, which mostly goes beyond money, is that by doing that, you put everybody at the table. So you're able, especially in the land, which is Southwestern Ontario, which is 95% privately owned, very dispersed, a lot of parcels. It's not like you go up north when you have large piece of land that could be crown land. Here we really like private land and parcels. So you really need to get a high level of coordination to be sure you can restore ecosystems and ecosystem corridors. And so this bond provided an arena for people to engage beyond the transaction into different projects. So what we've seen over the years is that not only helped restore some lands, but it also helped build some relationships. So what we have right now is we're on phase 3. So we had Long Point, which was the pilot number 2. Now we're looking at Niagara, which is pilot number 3. And we're also looking at what could this be like a large impact bond at the level of the ecoregion, like Carolinian zone? Because usually what the research shows is that you want to coordinate action at the level of the ecoregion, because this is where ecosystems somehow align with each other. So right now is how can we do that as a large scale an ecoregion? Well, it could be like a 10, 20 million project. And this is a difficult question, okay? Because when you look at Dishkan-Zibi at this point, what makes this project successful is that there were a lot of meetings, a lot of learning from each other beyond the transactions, like learning about indigenous culture, visiting the land. We brought the investors to the land so they could learn about the seeds, so they can restart the relationship. So how can we really replicate this place-based mechanisms in a larger scale? That's a challenging question. So this is what we've been working on with the team right now and with the partners. And Julie Bernard was a postdoctoral scholar with me. I've been working on that for 18 months here. And this is where we are right now in our research, what we believe this type of model looks like. So when you think in terms of replication or scalings, usually when you look at a business school in economics, you have 2 ways of thinking about scale. So you have an economies of scale and economies of scope. So scale is okay, you become big, so you have some knowledge. It's like the Walmart, and the bigger you got, the big supply chain, and this is how you're gonna get some economies and become big. The economies of scope is a little different. So let's imagine you're a farmer, and at one point you'd have pigs, and you use the manure to also do, I don't know, get the manure to grow some seeds somewhere else, So that's more scope. So you have 2 products with one supply chain. Our argument right now in the state of the research we are right now is that we say there's Dishkan-Zibi, or currently in Canada, conservation impact bond model is more what we call an economy of relationships. So what do we mean by that? Is that if you look at the pilots, and especially Dishkan-Zibi that we've been studying really, really in deep, what is really important to the success of the project is that everybody was really focused on the land. It's a really land-based, community-based project. So people come to the table with different initiatives, different success factors, the investors, the outcome payers, the conservationists, farmers. It's not like people will usually agree with each other, but what they do have in common is a love for land and the fact that they want to get a natural infrastructure, a green infrastructure that works, because they all have some interest in doing that. What we've seen as well is that we have bi-weekly meeting with the leadership team, and the leadership team represents each partner, you know, like representative of the research team, of the outcome payers, of the habitat partners, everyone who is part of the project can participate in the biweekly meetings. This leadership team is really important because they literally get the roots into the land, and they have the relationship with the partners, the habitat partners, indigenous partners. But what we see is that you cannot expect, as you replicate, to have all the habitat partners having the same depths, you know, in terms of relationship, because it's a full-time job really to visit the nations, to get trust, you know. So what we see is like the leads are a bit like the every replication, you have different leaves, but the leadership team stays the trend, you know. So when the leadership team of Carolina Canada moved from Deshkan-Zibi to Long Point, they've already had some relationships there with nations and partners and habitats. So they don't come from nowhere, you know. And so what is really important to know about this is that it's really based on relationships. So what are the key takeaways, assuming this is the correct model of what we see in terms of scaling, this model of scaling? Then what we have is, what you can think about is the economies of relationship at each bound is like this little tree, and then you form forest, you know? But if this is an accurate model, as right now, we haven't yet peer evaluated what we did, but I'm quite confident this is what we see. Then the funding of natural infrastructure should go to the team, to the trunk, to the relationships. And when I was looking at Marina's presentation at the beginning, often natural infrastructures only focus, the funding only focus on the transaction and the outcomes and on the relationships. What we show in Deshkan-Zibi in our project is that relationship matter to everything. There will be no project such as Deshkan-Zibi if there has not been relationship funding. And so we need to be sure that some people are being paid to plant the trees and to nurture the relationship with people so they can heal and restore relationship. So that's the thing. I'm gonna go faster on this. There was a key consideration as we do for assurance now, because as we scale, we want to get some assurance levels for the outcome payers. So third-party evaluators versus assurance. And that's something we look at right now in terms of replication. Potentially, the answer is to get one outcome metric to be assured by an auditor according to a principle, and to have the other metrics being not assured per se, but having some third-party evaluator. As we grow as well, there's some questions about 2ICing, because by design, there are more Western people than Indigenous peoples in those type of projects. So which responsibility is to get the 2ICing? Should we always ask Indigenous people to be the one responsible for indigenizing the practices? We don't think it's feasible. So it does require each organization involved to indigenize the practices and create ethical space. So what we have shown in the research as well is that the Deshkan-Zibi and the project have had effects on organizations, that Western people within the organization who participated in CIB ended up trying to transform the organizations as well to get more Indigenous leadership. So that was quite interesting as well. But we have an answer to this question. I think as we scale and replicate and learn from it, we'll know more about how to do it in the future. So I'm going to stop here because I want to let some time for Q&A. Merci.
I love this project. It is my heart. It is everything to me. And one of the things that I really learned from all of the work that the Deshkan-Zibi bond has shown us is that relationships make natural infrastructure projects durable. If you want to guarantee return on investment, it means you need durable relationships. And that is how we build connection with the land, and we build value with the land. And that, it's why the carbon market is getting a lot of flack and failing, because a lot of carbon projects don't have relationships and 2ICing and benefit sharing agreements with Indigenous peoples embedded in their concept. Let's turn it over to some questions, and I think that we've answered quite a few questions, but there is one maybe. like what, maybe like because we've got about 3 minutes left. So why don't we just, maybe I could ask each 3 speakers to end off with like 1 minute on a question that is really, I think, a general one, but one you can each have a different take on, which is, are we succeeding in making nature investable? Who wants to go first?
Oh, I can start. My answer will build on what we've learned when we talked to different investors during our study, and what we've the message that we got from investors is that they perceive that nature-based solutions to natural infrastructure now is less risky. So I mean, they are aware, starting to be aware of the risks, nature risks on the operations, and also starting to be interested in carbon credits, biodiversity credits. But I think we're making steps, but they're small. So I would say that it's a move in the right direction, but we really need to engage more. So we really need to have those kind of collaborative projects, finance projects, like the one Dan Laura was talking about. So I think that will be the key to make the nature investable.
I'll maybe offer, I mean, I think we're making progress, Kim, on this. I think certainly the better we are at measuring outcomes and creating metrics that standardize, units of measurement, we can express those outcomes. Companies are, in many cases thirsting for abilities to, report on TNFD and TCFD and talk about some of the benefits of the work that they're doing as well. So I think we are getting better at it, but I think being able to improve the way we express those outcomes and then monetize them is really important too, to keep developing.
Totally, Dan. That's why, the Natural Assets Initiative this summer, we released the first Canadian standard on ecosystem service inventories and valuations with the Canadian Standards Association, because we think that, there needs to be a standardized approach to ecosystem service inventories and valuations. It will be different in every single place on how that actually looks on paper. But if we have a standardized approach, we can move in the right direction, and standards are so important. Mm-hmm. What about you?
So I think for me, we have had 30 years of environmental psychology that shows that if you just bring economic incentives, so that you take away the economic incentives, people we go back to the previous behaviors, So money only is not going to be the solution. The only way we're going to treat and get nature-based solution and restore land and nature will be to change our relationship with that nature, and that has been proved over and over. So I think for me, what we have to do is to be more radical. We need to reinvent the way we relate to nature. We need to put back the relationships to our decision of capital allocation and valuation. And I agree with Rob, the measurement system is always a key thing, but it's a key thing because we use it as an excuse not to move forward. It's quite easy. We have a lot of research on ecosystem valuation services. We have hundreds of data points. So I think we are really all well resources right now to move forward. So it's really a question of will and collective movement. So I encourage everyone to move forward with me, I guess.
So that was so great. And I hope that folks can engage with all of you after this. We're going to send out an email tomorrow with this recording, some key takeaways, and an evaluation survey. Please complete the webinar evaluation survey if you can. And feel free to reach out to any of our panelists today. They're wealths of knowledge, and I really appreciate all of you for spending the time here, being in relationship, creating this ethical space, to bring forward like a number of knowledge systems emerging in this natural infrastructure space, because we need more spaces like this. And I want to thank IISD for convening this wonderful panel. I really appreciate the work you guys are publishing, and really look forward to engaging with all of you and continuing to build this really fruitful market.
Merci.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks everyone.